Your grandmother's house? Oh, honey. I already signed the papers. We needed the money, and honestly, it was just sitting there collecting dust. He said it like he was telling me the weather. My stepbrother actually laughed in the background. I could hear him. I was sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage, still in scrubs, 12 hours into a shift, and my stepfather had just told me over the phone that he'd sold the only thing my grandmother ever left me. The house on Millbrook Lane. The one with the green shutters she painted herself every spring. The one where I learned to bake biscuits and read my first chapter books curled up on her porch swing. And he laughed. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I just sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the hum of the parking garage and the distant sound of my stepbrother still chuckling about something. Then I said very quietly, "Thanks for letting me know." And I hung up. He would tell me later that my calm response unnerved him more than any shouting would have. He didn't understand it. He thought I was in shock. He thought I'd accepted it. He had no idea what I was already thinking. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 31 years old. I'm a registered nurse who spent 3 years working ICU at a level 1 trauma center, and I am the only biological grandchild of Eleanor Voss, a woman who survived the Great Flood of 1993 in Missouri, raised 4 kids on the school teacher's salary, and once chased a raccoon out of her kitchen with a broom while singing hymns. She was the toughest, most quietly determined person I have ever known, and she left me her house. Not my mother, not my stepfather, not my stepbrother, not my stepbrother, me. She was specific about it. I know because I sat in her lawyer's office with her when she updated her will 3 years before she passed. I was 26. Grandma Eleanor held my hand across the table and said, "This house has been in our family for 60 years. I want it to stay that way." The lawyer, a careful man named Mr. Powson, Delacroix, had walked us through every detail. The house on Millbrook Lane in Hannibal, Missouri, was to pass to me, outright, upon her death. No conditions. No shared ownership. Mine. She died 14 months ago, quietly, in that same house. In her own bed, the way she always said she wanted to go. I was with her. My mother remarried when I was 12. My stepfather, I'll call him Ray because that's his name, and I stopped protecting him a long time ago, came into our lives with a big personality, a louder than necessary truck, and a son 2 years older than me named Garrett. Garrett was the kind of person who moved through life assuming things would be handed to him, and they usually were because Ray made sure of it. Whatever Garrett wanted, Ray found a way to provide. Whatever I needed, I learned to provide for myself. My mother loved Ray. I think she still does. That's the part that took me the longest to make peace with. Not what Ray did, but the fact that my mother let him. After Grandma Eleanor passed, the estate went through probate without issue. The house transferred to my name by early spring. I had a deed. I had a lawyer. I had documentation of everything. What I didn't have was time, because 6 weeks after the transfer was finalized, I accepted a travel nursing contract in Seattle. 18 months, good money, a chance to pay down my student loans, and get distance from a city that had been feeling smaller and smaller since Grandma died. I arranged for a property management company in Hannibal to check on the house monthly. I paid the property taxes. I kept the utilities on low. I was not neglecting it. I was working. My mother knew the property management arrangement. I had told her explicitly, "The house is mine. It's being looked after. Please don't involve yourself or Ray in anything related to it." She agreed. She said she understood what I did not know. What I would not find out until that phone call in the parking garage 11 months into my contract was that Ray had been telling people in town that the house was sitting unused and a burden on the family. He had been talking to a real estate developer, a man who'd been trying to buy up older properties in that part of Hannibal for a mixed-use development project. And somewhere in those conversations, Ray had apparently convinced himself and the developer that he had the authority to move forward. He signed a purchase agreement. He did not have my signature. He did not have power of attorney. He did not have anything except his own audacity and the apparent assumption that I was too far away and too busy to notice. The developer had given him an earnest money deposit. Ray had already spent part of it. When I hung up the phone that night in the parking garage, I sat very still for about 4 minutes. Then I called my grandmother's attorney, Mr. Delacroix. It was after business hours. I left a message. Then I called a real estate attorney I'd looked up in Missouri, whose reviews specifically mentioned property fraud cases. I left another message. Then I went back upstairs and finished my shift. Because my patients needed me, and because there was nothing useful I could do at 11 o'clock at night that I couldn't do better at 8 in the morning with a clear head. That is something the ICU teaches you. You cannot panic and be useful at the same time. You triage, you stabilize, you act when you can act effectively. Ray had mistaken my steadiness for weakness my entire life. He was about to find out what it actually was. Mr. Delacroix called me back the next morning before I'd finished my coffee. I walked him through everything Ray had told me. There was a pause on the line, and then he said carefully, "Nora, the deed is in your name. It was recorded with the county. No one can legally sell that property without your signature and a notarized conveyance document. Whatever Ray signed, it isn't binding." "Can he be held liable?" I asked. Another pause. "That depends on what representations he made to the buyer. If he represented himself as having authority to sell a property he did not own, that's potentially fraud." I wrote that word down. Fraud. I underlined it twice. Over the next 2 weeks, I built a file. I obtained a copy of the purchase agreement Ray had signed. The developer's attorney sent it over once I established that I was the actual owner and threatened to report the transaction to the Missouri Real Estate Commission. I pulled the county property records, which clearly showed my name on the deed. I got a written statement from the property management company confirming their contract with me. I had Mr. Delacroix send a formal cease and desist to Ray and to the developer's attorneys. The developer was not happy. He had acted in what he believed was good faith. He'd been given documents by Ray, documents that I can only describe as creative, because they bore my name on lines I had never touched. His attorneys pivoted fast. Within a week, they had turned on Ray completely, submitting their own complaint to the county sheriff's office. My mother called me when the sheriff's deputy showed up at their house. "Nora," she said, "you have to stop this. You're humiliating him." I want to be honest about what happened inside me when she said that. There was grief there. Real grief. Because I understood in that moment that she had known. Maybe not everything. Maybe not the forged documents. But she had known Ray was talking to developers. She had known he thought of that house as an asset to be liquidated. And she had said nothing to me. "Mom," I said, "he forged my signature on a real estate document." Silence. "I didn't raise you to be vindictive," she finally said. "You didn't raise me to be a doormat either," I said. "Or maybe you did, and I just didn't take that lesson." I hung up. And I didn't call her back for 3 months. I want to tell you about what it's like to work nights in an ICU, because I think it matters to understanding who I am and why I handled this the way I did. You see people at the absolute worst moments of their lives. You see families fracture under pressure, and families pull together in ways you didn't think were possible anymore. You hold hands with strangers who are terrified. You make decisions under conditions where the wrong call has real consequences. You learn very quickly that emotion and action are 2 separate things. You can feel everything and still think clearly. You have to. The feelings don't go away. You just learn to set them aside until there's space to have them. I had a lot of feelings about Ray. I had feelings about the house, about my grandmother, about my mother's silence. I set all of it aside and kept moving because that's what you do when the situation requires it. What I also had by the time I flew back to Missouri 2 months later was a very complete legal case. The county sheriff's office had opened an investigation. Ray had retained a defense attorney. The developer had filed a civil suit against Ray for fraud and misrepresentation, seeking return of the earnest money plus damages. My own attorney had sent formal notification that I would be pursuing civil action for the forged documents and any costs incurred as a result of the unauthorized transaction. Ray, as it turned out, had already spent a significant portion of that earnest money. His attorney's fees alone were going to cost more than he had available in savings. He had to sell his bass boat, his most prized possession, the thing he talked about more than he talked about any person in his life, to cover the initial retainer. I will not pretend I felt nothing when I heard that. I felt something. I'm not sure it was satisfaction exactly. It was more like the specific exhaustion of watching a situation finally align with reality after a long period in which reality had been bent out of shape. I flew into sync line, Louis on a Tuesday morning and drove the 2.5 hours to Hannibal by myself. I didn't tell my mother I was coming. I went straight to Mr. Delacroix's office to sign documents, and then I drove out to Millbrook Lane. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the way places always do when you've been carrying a larger version of them in your heart. The green shutters were peeling a little. The front porch needed a board replaced. The yard had gone shaggy, but the bones were all there, just the same as they'd been since 1961, when my great-grandfather built the foundation by hand. I stood in the driveway for a long time before I went inside. It smelled like her. Faintly, after more than a year, but still, something in the wood or the curtains or the particular quality of afternoon light to the east windows. I sat down on the floor of the living room, which is something I would normally never do, and I just breathed. I thought about Grandma Eleanor, about the summer she taught me to play gin rummy and refused to let me win even once until I was good enough to beat her legitimately, about the way she used to hum to herself while she cooked, these old songs I didn't know the names of, and I'd ask her to teach them to me, and she'd wave me off and say they were too old and I'd learn my own songs in time. I thought about how she had sat in that lawyer's office and looked at me and said, "This house has been in our family for 60 years. I want it to stay that way." She knew what she was doing. She had seen Ray clearly, long before I was willing to. I stayed 3 days. I replaced the porch board myself. Badly, but it held. I painted the shutters. I sorted through some boxes in the back bedroom that I'd been putting off since the funeral. I found a photograph of Grandma Eleanor as a young woman, maybe 25, standing outside this same house, laughing at something off camera, and she looked so alive that I had to put it face down for a while before I could look at it again. On the last evening, I sat on the porch swing as it got dark, and I thought about what came next. My mother came to see me on the second day. I hadn't invited her, but I wasn't surprised. She pulled up in her minivan and sat in the driveway for a few minutes before coming to the door. I watched her from the window. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy and didn't know where to put it down. I let her in. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, and for a while, neither of us said anything. "I didn't know about the documents," she said finally. "The signatures. I didn't know he did that." "I believe you," I said, and I did. My mother is many things, but she is not someone who would knowingly participate in forgery. I knew he was talking to that developer. She said, "He told me the house was going to just sit empty and fall apart, and that you'd be better off with the money." "He told you that," I said, "and you didn't call me." She looked at her hands. "He said you were busy, that you had your career, your life out there. He said he was just exploring options." "Mom," I kept my voice even, "that house is mine." Grandma left it to me specifically, not to the family, not to be liquidated when it became convenient. To me. "I know that." "Then you knew what he was doing was wrong before it ever got to the point it did." She didn't answer that. There was nothing to answer with. We talked for a long time, and not all of it was hard. We talked about Grandma Eleanor, about old memories, about things that had nothing to do with Ray, or houses, or legal documents. By the time she left, it wasn't fixed. I don't think it will be fully fixed for a long time. But something had shifted. She hugged me in the doorway and held on longer than she needed to. I didn't ask her to leave Ray. I don't know if she will or won't. That's not my decision to make, and honestly, it's not the point. The civil case settled 8 months later. Ray agreed to a judgment covering my attorney's fees, the property management costs incurred during the period of disruption, and additional amount for the time and stress the situation created. He did not admit wrongdoing in the settlement language, which is standard, but the county investigation remained open at that point, and I understand the outcome there was not favorable to him either. The developer's civil suit also settled. Ray paid that one too, with money he borrowed from Garrett, which struck me as a fitting conclusion. Garrett finally providing for Ray, for once, instead of the other way around. I'm back in Missouri now. Not permanently yet, but more permanently than I expected. I took a position at a hospital 45 minutes from Hannibal. Not my original plan, but plans change. I'm renting a small apartment near the hospital during the week and spending most of my weekends out at Millbrook Lane. The porch board is holding. The shutters look better than they have in years. I'm learning the names of the old songs Grandma used to hum. I found a stack of her records in the basement and I've been working my way through them. There's a particular quality to early mornings out there, before the heat settles in, when the light is still low and the yard is still, and the only sound is birds in the oak tree at the edge of the property. I drink my coffee on the porch, and sometimes I talk to her, to Grandma Eleanor, the way you do when someone is gone but hasn't quite finished teaching you things. She knew what she was doing when she left me this house. She knew exactly what she was protecting and who she was protecting it from. She had seen more of the situation than I had, and she had made sure as carefully as she could that no one could take it away. She was almost right. Almost, but close enough. Because here I am, the house is still standing, the shutters are green, and it belongs to me. There's a particular moment I keep coming back to. I'm sitting in a hospital parking garage, still in scrubs, and the man my mother chose is on the other end of the line, telling me, laughing while he tells me, that he sold the house my grandmother specifically, deliberately, lovingly left to me. And my response was 4 words. Thanks for letting me know. I've thought about why I said that. It wasn't performance. It wasn't strategy in that moment. It was just, there was nothing useful I could do at 11 o'clock at night except not fall apart. And I had learned, in 3 years of working nights in an ICU, that falling apart is a choice you defer until you can afford it. What Ray never understood about me is that steadiness isn't the same as passivity. He saw a woman who didn't raise her voice and assumed she wouldn't raise anything else either. He had been reading me wrong my entire life, and that misreading cost him his base boat and a significant portion of his savings and whatever remaining credibility he had in a town where people eventually find out what you've done. That's not luck. That's not fate in any cosmic sense. That's just the straightforward math of choices. He made a decision to forge a signature on a legal document for a property that was not his. Every consequence that followed was a direct line from that decision. The developer's civil suit, the county investigation, the attorney's fees he couldn't cover. None of it was punishment delivered from outside. It was the structure of reality doing exactly what it does when you try to take something that isn't yours. It catches up. What I had and what I think made the difference was 3 things that I didn't have names for at the time but recognize now. The first is integrity, not as an abstract value, but as a practical one. I had kept records. I had a deed in my name. I had documentation because I had done everything right. And doing things right is its own form of protection even when it doesn't feel like it. Grandma Eleanor lived that way. She taught it without teaching it, just by the way she moved through the world. The second is the ability to think clearly when everything in you wants to react. That's not something you're born with. You build it slowly, through practice and necessity. I built it in the ICU. You might build it somewhere else entirely, but the capacity to feel the full weight of a situation and still decide your next move carefully. That's not coldness. That's the most useful thing I know. The third is the willingness to see a hard thing through, even when it would be easier to let it go. People told me in various ways to drop it. My mother told me I was being vindictive. Ray's whole posture assumed I wouldn't follow through. There is a version of me, maybe a younger version, who would have quietly accepted the loss because confrontation felt like too much. But Grandma Eleanor didn't raise a version of me who couldn't see things through. She made sure of that. The house on Millbrook Lane is still standing. The shutters are green. Some mornings I sit on the porch before the heat comes in, and it is so quiet that I can almost hear her humming. She knew what she was protecting. She knew exactly who she was protecting it from. She gave me every tool I needed. All I had to do was use them.